Hello out there, all my bookish friends in booktube land. I hope that you're all very well. In this video we're going to be taking a look at Thomas Hardy's The Mayor of Casterbridge, a brilliant book, and we're going to do an in-depth review. So without further ado, let's dig in, shall we? The Mayor of Casterbridge is a phenomenally good book. Thomas Hardy as an author is superb. In a recent video where I covered the books I read in March, I gave this book a 5 out of 5. It's spectacular. Now, one of the things about Hardy, if you've never read him before, he's an author I always recommend when people ask me, what books can I read which are not just stories, but which focus on a deeper level, a deeper meaning or exploration of some idea. Hardy always has an angle when it comes to his stories. He's always picking up some philosophical point of view that he's either believing in or testing. And when we say philosophical, it's not that hair-splitting, nitpicking, trying to define words down to the last atom kind of philosophy. We're talking worldviews. Everybody has a philosophy. If you believe that philosophy is not necessary, that's a philosophy. So everyone has an underpinning arrangement of beliefs and ideas and things they hold to be true, which affects how they interact with things. And Hardy explores a particular philosophy or idea towards what it means to be human, what existence is, this world that we inhabit, the meaning of life as it were, in this book. And what's amazing about it is what he looks at is very much alive and kicking today. So let's take a look at what he's actually exploring in The Mayor of Casterbridge. It's in chapter 17 of the book that Thomas Hardy writes a sentence as part of a paragraph which gives us the underpinnings for the whole thesis that he's exploring in this story through all the characters that interact in this story, primarily the main character, Michael Henchard. Thomas Hardy writes this from Michael Henchard's perspective when talking about arrival in the book. But most probably luck had little to do with it. Character is fate, said Novalis, and Farfrae's character was just the reverse of Henchard's. This is the idea, the belief that is being explored through this book. Character is fate. Novalis is a German poet, writer. He said that character is another word for fate. In other words, when we are born, when we grow up as children, we are disposed to certain traits. We might be disposed to being affectionate. We might be disposed to love. We might be disposed to hate, to greed, to anger. You name it, we're disposed to it. And that will determine everything that happens in our life. Now, no one argues that character affects our life, but what this is saying is character is fate. Your character cannot change. Who you are fundamentally is set, and it predetermines what will happen to you in your entire life. In this book, I get the sense that Hardy believes this, and the time period he was living in would definitely lend itself to a kind of determinism. In the humanist sort of atmosphere of the day, breaking everything down in the scientific revolution, everything was becoming atomized, like get down to the nitty-gritty, and everything works on a level that chemistry can answer. Today, that idea is very much alive. There is a certain element who believe that we are so determined by the chemical interactions of our body that we don't have free will, for instance, that we cannot choose, that everything is pre-written by our chemical interactions, and therefore we will do what we will do and nothing can change it. Is that true? In this book, Hardy looks at that idea. So let's have a look, shall we? By the way, if you love literature and you really want to go deep into books and really pull out the hypotheses and the ideas and the themes, really explore it, then please hit the subscribe button and ring the bell, because on this channel I endeavour to give book reviews which are very deep. Maybe not exhaustive, but very deep. Anyway, back to the book. If you haven't read this book, I'm about to cover the plot, so there's going to be spoilers in this. If you have read the book and you don't want to hear a recap of the plot, then skip ahead to the next section, or if you'd like a refresher, stick around for the next few minutes. The book starts with the main character, Michael Henchard, heading into a village with his wife Susan and their babe in arms, Elizabeth Jane. There's a fete in the village and Michael goes in. He's 21 years of age and he gets drunk on rum firmity, a very potent drink of the day. Under the influence of alcohol, he sells his wife and his daughter to a chap called Newsom, who's a sailor. He doesn't know, he's never met the chap before, but he sells them. And in the morning, when he comes around and he's beginning to sober up, he realises that he has actually sold his wife and child. The next chapter starts 20 years later. Susan, Michael's wife that he sold, she's a simple soul and thought that because it was a monetary transaction, it was legally binding, so she happily became the wife of this other man. They now think the new man dead, and Susan and the grown-up Elizabeth Jane go to search for Michael Henchard. Now, Elizabeth Jane doesn't know who he is. She's never been told of the past, and so she just believes that Newsom is her father, but they're going to see him as a distant relative, is what her mum calls him. When they find him in the town of Casterbridge, lo and behold, he's the mayor. He's a really influential man. He is the chief corn merchant in the whole area. He is wealthy. And they find out that since the day he sold them, he's never touched a drop of alcohol. What's interesting is Hardy is going to look at the character of a person and whether they can change. Because on the face of it, he has changed. He doesn't drink. He hasn't got married, although he does have a love interest somewhere else in the story who he's considering marrying, because after 20 years he thinks his wife could be dead by now. He's become a responsible person. He's become a person who is respected, as opposed to this stray who just went from village to village when he was younger. So on the face of it, he's changed. But things will now conspire, and there is an inner character. The book says he has the same volcanic stuff stirring beneath the rind of Michael Henchard. In other words, the character doesn't change. Michael, when he realises Susan is still alive, he arranges affairs so that he can marry her. They still don't tell Elizabeth Jane about the past and that he is her father. He also employs a young man for his business called Farfrae. He's a Scottish lad. And he's a lovely, well-disposed guy. Everybody likes him. He's quite intelligent. And he helps Michael Henchard's business grow bigger and bigger and bigger and become very prosperous. However, there's an altercation one day where Farfrae disagrees with Michael Henchard over the treatment of a particular worker. And Farfrae dares to say it in front of everybody. Everyone sides with him. Everyone thinks he's wonderful and kind and that Henchard is a bit of an ogre. And then they begin to credit Henchard's success all to Farfrae. Now, for anyone that's familiar with Bible stories, this is very much a Saul and David situation. You know, the women sang, Saul has killed his thousands, David his tens of thousands, and King Saul began to look jealously and enviously upon David and wanted to kill him. The same references are made by Hardy to Henchard and Farfrae. And his jealousy, his envy comes up, and he begins to act hostilely to this one that he did favour. So there's a rift eventually. And Farfrae goes and makes his own business, which prospers more than Michael Henchard's. Eventually, Susan, the wife, dies. And that's when Michael says to Elizabeth Jane, listen, I'm your real father. And he gives her a bit of the backstory. And she's shocked and she has to go away for the night to think about what she's just been told and whether she can accept him as her dad. And while she's away, he finds a letter from his wife who's just died. And in this letter it says, Michael, Elizabeth Jane is not your daughter. Your daughter died 3 years after leaving. And I had another daughter with this man Newsome, and I called her Elizabeth Jane as well. And this is who it is. Now the next morning, she comes in, kisses him, and says, I will accept you as my father. And he ends up becoming quite cold towards her because it's not his daughter. Everything is going wrong in his life. And eventually, the girl that he originally loved and wanted to marry, she turns up in Casterbridge, but she bumps into Farfrae, his enemy, and they get married, would you believe? Eventually he tells Elizabeth Jane the truth, that he isn't her father, and that her father had visited looking for her, but he had sent him away, and Elizabeth detests him for that, and he ends up dying somewhere in a hovel. So, yeah, not the happiest book, but that's Hardy pretty much through and through. So that's the story. Now let's dig around for the meanings and ideas beneath this whole excellent story. Remember, what is being explored is this idea that character is fate. That your destiny is already almost predetermined by your disposition when you are born or past your first formative years. And Henchard is a good example of if this is true. Because he may have given up drink. He may have reformed himself from the man he was who sold his wife and daughter. But when things eventually went wrong, when troubles reappeared, when he was challenged by a younger man who was getting the credit that he wanted, he began to be this angry, rebellious, strident character, which caused the demise of his life. His world fell apart. Chapter 19, shortly after his wife Susan dies, and he's already broken up with Farfrae, this lad who he really got on with, and Elizabeth Jane at this point doesn't know that Michael's her father. He hasn't told her that bit yet. He still believes he's her father. This is what Hardy says. Henchard's wife was dissevered from him by death, his friend and helper Farfrae by estrangement, Elizabeth Jane by ignorance. Here we get this idea that Michael's life is determined to go wrong. Sarah has died, so he has no one with him. Farfrae is estranged, so he's lost connection to someone else. Elizabeth isn't yet his daughter because she doesn't know that he's her father. Although that later turns out to be wrong, he doesn't know it at this time. So he can't connect. Now, all of this has taken place because of his disposition. So character is fate. And then when he finally tells Elizabeth Jane, I'm your father, but then finds the letter from Susan which says, actually, this is a different Elizabeth Jane to your daughter, his reaction is very telling because Hardy puts it this way. But now, through his passionate head, there stormed this thought, that the blasting disclosure was what he had deserved. So the blasting disclosure was this letter which said, Elizabeth Jane is not your daughter. He's just told her that he's her father. And he says, it's what I deserve. It's fate. It's the consequence of his actions, of his bad character in the past. It's karma. Everything that we are causes what we're going to become. And to a degree, you can see that the past is coming back to haunt him. Nothing wrong with that. But the way Henchard views life and the way Hardy writes him in this story, he refers to the gods behind things. Hardy was not a classical Christian. He was more of a humanist. He was very, very progressive and liberal. He believed in the sciences and the progress of humanity, but he also had a wonderment for nature. He sensed that there was something spiritual to nature. He writes that about Henchard. Henchard believes that there's some kind of strong hand directing the affairs of men, but he calls it the gods. So some kind of ethereal element that we can't quite get our hands on. But there's this predestination, this inevitability that our future will work out the way it works out because we cannot change who we are fundamentally. And that will always determine our outcome. Interestingly, the morning after he tells Elizabeth Jane that he's her father, she comes down and she says, I accept you as father. And then look at what Hardy writes. Henchard bent and kissed her cheek. The moment and the act he had prefigured for weeks with a thrill of pleasure, yet it was no less than a miserable insipidity to him now that it had come. So his one joy, his one hope for love, has gone, because he's just found out Elizabeth Jane is not his daughter, and he's just kissed her cheek. He's been waiting for that, and it's all been taken from him. It's the inevitable outcome for the kind of guy that he is. Now, it's very worthwhile mentioning at this point, related to love, that there are two birds mentioned specifically in this book which have a symbolic meaning. At the beginning of the book, when he sells Susan and the baby, there's this passing comment that the last swallow of summer leaves. And you think it's just this pastoral piece of trivia to paint the picture. But swallows have a symbolism, very much like flowers have symbolisms. Swallows mean loyalty, love, and peace. So it was saying that when he made that decision to sell Susan and the young baby, loyalty, love, and peace flew from his life. His character could never have or make room for loyalty, love, and peace, no matter how much he wanted it. He tried to get it through making a name for himself as a mayor, as a businessman. He tried to do the right thing by Susan by marrying her, even though he hadn't seen her all this time, and he wanted love from Elizabeth Jane. But it all frittered away. And interestingly, his other love interest, called Lucette, she arrives on the scene later with the plan of marrying him, but when she bumps into Farfrae, she marries him quickly. And what does that show? Loyalty had vanished from a man such as Michael Henchard, and he never had peace of mind. So that comment about the swallow at the beginning of the book, if you're studying it or you like to get a lot out of your books, go and find it and just highlight what the swallow means. There is another bird that will come later, but we'll talk about that in due time. Michael Henchard is not the only person in the book for which character is fate. For the idea that Hardy is exploring to be true, it would have to hold true of all of the characters. You can't say character is fate for one person and not the other. And this applies to Farfrae. He's easygoing, likeable, generous, kind, understanding, and everything he touches turns to gold. It's harmonising his fate with his character. He is successful because of the character that he is. Elizabeth Jane, too, is fated by her character. She's gentle, she's caring, she's nursing and loving, but she's blown by every whim and wave of misery and sorrow that sweeps past her from those around her. Her life's not her own. And there's a statement Hardy makes regarding this character is fate with Elizabeth as well. It says, "To learn to take the universe seriously, there is no quicker way than to watch, to be a waker, as the country people call it." And it says that through the night she begins thinking about things. And then it says, "And all this while, the subtle-souled girl asking herself why she was born, why sitting in a room and blinking at the candle, why things around her had taken the shape they wore in preference to every other possible shape." Have you ever wondered something like that yourself? I know I have. How on earth did my life work out to be right here talking to you on camera right now out of all the myriad different lives we could have lived from the moment we were born? To a degree, it seems like we were fated or destined to get here. And she's beginning to think, how did I get into this situation? This is when she's been turned down. This is when she's not married the man that she wanted to marry, which was Farfrae. And he is going to marry someone else, even though he was interested in Elizabeth to start with. How did she get to this point? Is it because of her character, the way she just accommodates everybody else, puts everyone else first? Is that why she's always left at the bottom of the heap? Is her character her fate? This idea is found in every single character in the book. Even some of the bit part players, like Jop. So predetermined is the outcome of our lives according to the characters we are born with, in Hardy's view in this book. is pointed out really close to the end of the book in a comment that Henchard makes or is thinking towards Elizabeth Jane. It says in chapter 44, "It was an odd sequence that out of all this tampering with social law came that flower of nature, Elizabeth. Part of his wish to wash his hands of life arose from his perception of its contrarious inconsistencies, of nature's jaunty readiness to support unorthodox social principles." Now, that's a bit wordy. However, what he's saying is, one of the reasons he wants to wash his hands of life is because whatever constructs we put up socially, societally, however arbitrary or moral codes or whatever it may be, we try and construct things to shape life. Nature seems to accommodate it. Instead of it hindering nature, nature seems to just work through whatever constructs and produces its end result anyway. So Henchard is feeling, there is nothing I can do. From that moment when I sold them, there is nothing I could do to ever change the outcome of my miserable life. Very fatalistic. And in a sense, living in the 1880s and thinking of the things Hardy saw, you could see that line of reason. And it's very much alive and kicking today. That things are almost materially predestined. That we have no free will. And that seems to be, to a degree, not totally, what Hardy is coming to in this book. But, and here is the wonderful thing about literature, Hardy leaves the answer open-ended where the character is fate. Although I sense that he is inclined to believe it to a large degree, he places a deliberate hole at the end of the book when Elizabeth Jane ends up marrying Farfrae, and it all works out well for her. So her character, was it destined to be sorrowful or was it destined to be happy? She had experienced both. So we do have some effect over things. Also, Michael had the chance to kill Farfrae at one point, had him dangling out of a window, and then changed his mind. So he was able to conquer that disposition within himself. But here is the kicker. The biggest hole in the idea that character is fate is this. The character fate determinism in this book can't be separated from the character of the author. In other words, Thomas Hardy's own character, if his idea is true, had to write the book that he wrote. Hardy couldn't work out a different way to end this book, because if character is fate, he has no choice but to say the things he says. His way of seeing things is predetermined. This is a huge hole in the idea, because it also means anyone reading this book can't be affected by it, or at least it can't change their way of seeing things. Because if they already have a character, then they are determined to see the world in a certain way. It actually makes all literature, all poetry, all art, all exploration and adventure, all thoughts redundant. Because if character is fate, there's no getting away from it. We may as well just walk out into the middle of the road, and if we get hit by a car, we'll get hit by a car. If we don't, that's fate. You see, it's too deterministic. And that's why you have this feeling of some spiritual element in the background. It's certainly not a Christian element, but Hardy can never, in all his books, Hardy can never separate himself from that. And actually, his ideas in this book seem to be challenged later, because about 6 years later, he would write Tess of the D'Urbervilles, and you can see an author whose mind is changing on what he believes. And if you look at Hardy's life, he would change even further on, particularly after the First World War. That had a massive effect on his outlook on progress and humanism. But it's amazing to see it in a book. Now, I did mention that there was one other bird. And that bird is right at the end of the book. Henchard hears that Elizabeth Jane is going to marry Farfrae. And Henchard no longer harbours any ill will. And he goes and he wants to give Elizabeth Jane something. And he takes them a wedding present. And what it is a goldfinch in a cage. And he takes it there and he hopes to see them. And he goes to speak to Elizabeth Jane. And she calls him Mr. Henchard. And he says, that hurts. You know, because I've viewed you like a daughter. And But she doesn't like him. He turned her real father away when he came looking for her, and she can't forgive him for this. And so she kicks him out. She just sends him away. Now, later on, they find this cage with a goldfinch, a dead goldfinch in it, outside the back door. No one knows where it's come from. Eventually, one of the servants says to Elizabeth Jane, "We've worked out where that goldfinch came from. It was from Mr. Henchard. He brought it on your wedding day." This changes Elizabeth a bit. What's the significance of a goldfinch? Goldfinches, in symbolism, refer to optimism, joy, hope, simplicity, happiness. Ultimately, Henchard wanted a happy, simple family life. That's when he saw Susan and Elizabeth come. That's what he wanted to set up. But remember how the swallow had flown? So love, loyalty and joy had gone. And now, closing at the book, optimism, happiness, joy, a simple, straightforward life adjoined to nature is laying dead at the bottom of the cage. What a brilliant bit of symbolism. And it tells you a lot about how hard he saw the world. He saw a lot of gloom in the world, and it seemed very pessimistic. And he saw how many people's lives just fell into what seemed like a fatal determinism. And Elizabeth goes to set things right, but as fate would have it, even at his deathbed, Henchard is fated not to get things right because they turn up just after he dies in a hovel. You see, his character apparently determined all of that. However, it can't strictly be true because, as we've said, if it were true, how much of Hardy's personal character would have affected the writing of the book. And if you've read anything about authors and how they view writing, you'll know that lots of them will say that the characters take over and become different to the author's ideas. John Fowles in The French Lieutenant's Woman explicitly says this, that he would have the characters do one thing, but when writing, they will do something else. And so that shows, since they're not real characters, that shows that he can't determine them by his own character. Well, I hope that this has been a diverting video for you and that you've got some enjoyment and insight into the book, The Mayor of Casterbridge, from it. Once again, please hit the like button and the subscribe button if you want to really get into more classics at a deeper level. In the meantime, I wish you joy in your reading.